The war had ended 1,000 years ago, yet somehow humanity still carried its scars among the stars. They were not scars you could see. Human ships gleamed the way all ships did, mirror-white hulls slipping through the dark like patient comets, registry codes etched in light along their spines, engines breathing a steady storm behind them. Their cities were warm and practical, threaded with gravity gardens and river corridors. They were neither the richest nor the poorest among the peoples. They were simply present, stubborn. The constellation of their colonies looked like a knotted fist near the edge of the Persian Drift, compact for defense, expanded just enough to breathe. In the long curve of galactic history, humanity had learned something unromantic and unbreakable: leave room for children. That was why Meadows Reach existed at all, a quiet arcology on the blue-green moon of Solace, under a stubborn sun that rose with the sound of bells in the air. 860 children lived there, a school because human planners had discovered a secret of diaspora. You could scatter a people to 10,000 worlds and they wouldn't forget who they were, if the laughter of children remained connected like threads through a loom. Meadows Reach, with its glass domes and oak-lined courtyards and the summer smell of cut grass, was one of a dozen such places. It did not train soldiers, it raised citizens. On the morning it happened, an exo-breeze carried the heavy scent of rain. Teachers monitored a drone contest over the lake. The school orchestra tuned its flutes. Someone baked bread. Somewhere, a child who would have become a great engineer fell in love with the idea that rivers had memory. Somewhere else, a child who would have become a patient surgeon discovered the pleasure of getting a math problem wrong and trying again. The ships that came through the upper atmosphere had no transponder beacons. The spaceport on the far side of Solace pinged them and received silence. A mining barge offered a warning blink and was split down the spine for the trouble. Then the ships squared themselves and fell. They were Kite, a people of stone spines and shimmering eye plates, a culture that had risen fast in the spinward arm and found itself hungry for leverage. Their war bands believed in calibration through fear. Cut one throat cleanly and the crowd would listen. Break one school and the species would kneel. At Meadows Reach, alarms began to sing. The head teacher, Elian Hfy, walked quickly. Not running would ripple panic faster than any siren. "Domes," she said calmly, and the domes responded. Transparent layers hardening into protective opacity, louvered shutters descending over windows with a soft hiss. Children moved in practiced clusters. Older ones guided younger ones along corridors lit with a warm white. Rope lines unreeled automatically from the walls and small hands found them. Drones clustered. Guardians arrived from the perimeter with heavy steps, AI eyes bright. A boy named Lin collected his sister's hand. A girl named Roa chewed her lip and pretended not to be afraid. Batteries of counterorbital missiles rose from discreet housings in the tall grass and pointed their cold noses at the sky. They were old, those launchers, antique compared to the razor-thin ships that hummed above, and yet they were not useless. Down from the clouds, black like spilled ink, the Kite came. They broke the first dome's shield with a focused spear of kinetic dust. They dropped a personnel pod into the second orchard. They cut the lake with a beam that turned water to steam and thunder. The ground bucked. Elian Hfy stood in the central hall with her hands at her sides, watching the enemy shapes ripple toward the ironwood doors. She murmured, "Hold the line." Above Solace, alarms flashed across a dozen human systems. The distress keyed itself to one word, a word older than the void: children. It moved through relay after relay like a pulse. In orbit around Vela's gate, Admiral Mara Iseul turned from a planning table and felt her stomach go cold. Mara was not a loud person. She measured her days in steady actions, and the small kindnesses leaders could afford if they chose. She had memorized the names of the schoolship captains who hauled students between the diaspora's learning halls. She could disassemble an engine pump with an engineer's patience. Her hair was going gray in a short, practical cut. The ring she wore was simple basalt from Luna. When she spoke, she tended to lower her voice so people leaned in to listen. Her flagship, Kite of Theseus, was not the fastest in the fleet. It was the one more officers asked to serve aboard because the coffee was always good, the corridors were clean, and the gravity wasn't set to save fuel at the cost of aching bones. Her crew did not cheer when she walked the main deck. They straightened their shoulders and breathed easier. "Meadows Reach," she said. The name ached. "Spin me a window." Tactical spun it, a hololithic image of a moon, cloud-wreathed and limned with atmosphere, a cluster of bright flares like bees stinging a serene surface. The Caesarathi ships were lean, built like knives, and they were cutting. Mara's voice was almost gentle. "All ships within 2 jumps burn." There were protocols about negotiations. There were diplomatic channels to open. The Caesarathi had a seat in the common forum now, however sullenly, and by treaty it was correct to inquire first. But in all the Accord's many documents, there was a quiet paragraph with no bannering at all. It referred to nothing but itself. It said, "If any power in this galaxy deliberately targets a human children's sanctuary, the protections of due process may be temporarily suspended by the nearest competent commander, provided that commander is prepared to stand trial for the decision with their full name." Mara's name was a simple line of letters, Mariseul. She had always been prepared. "Flag," she said, soft enough that only her bridge heard it. "Signal Solace, we are coming. Signal the Caesarathi commander, you are ordered to withdraw immediately. You have 3 minutes." The signal leapt, hit, and returned dead. The Caesarathi were doing something precise at the central hall. Breaching charges blossomed like sick flowers. Malin Sato stood without moving, though her eyes were wet. The Caesarathi had studied human architecture. They swept the corridor with cohesive light designed to kill without burning floors. The Guardians walked into it and dissolved like sleep. A child screamed and was hushed. Malin put herself between the enemy and the door. "You're kind," said the Caesarathi leader, his translator implant delighting in the music of his cruelty, "will learn the proper shape of fear." He lifted a blade grown of his own bone. She met his eyes through the translator's shimmer. "No," Malin said, "we will teach you what fear becomes." He killed her. The door cracked open, and what followed the Caesarathi into that classroom was the silence of 850 children not crying. Not yet. Their teachers had told them that silence could be a shield. The smallest ones pressed their foreheads to their knees, noses full of the chalk smell of learning. Older ones stood with their arms around one another. Outside, the old missile bays coughed. 2 Caesarathi ships in the upper atmosphere flared and fell, their armor peeled back like fruit skin. The others adapted. They employed countermeasures. They steadied their rhythms. On Kite of Theseus, time became a blade. 2 minutes, said the helm. Mara nodded. "Don't burn the engines hotter," she said calmly. "You blow a manifold and you buy us 4 seconds and we arrive with half a ship. Keep the balance. We join the fight complete or we die on the jump." She knew there would be recordings. She knew someone would edit them. She wanted her crew's faces to be clean in that history, not distorted with panic, not twisted with grief. "Breathe," she said softly. On Solace, the Caesarathi herded children out under a sky now bruised by the entry fire of incoming ships. They made the children kneel. They liked old gestures. They liked how humiliation could mature into the long whine of control. They carried the smallest ones under their arms. They told those tiny ones they were lucky because they got to fly. Lynn counted the suiciding of clouds. Roa chewed her lip until the blood came, then used her tongue to blot it away so she wouldn't leave a stain. The Caesarathi leader held a small boy by the scruff of his shirt, lifted him up so a camera could catch the scale of the difference, a predator, a prey. He intended to speak. He opened his teeth, drew a breath. One of the humans in a black caretaker's jacket moved. He had been waiting. He had taught the smallest ones to tie their shoes that morning. He had listened to the orchestra tune. He was unremarkable except for habitual kindness and the fact that he carried a pocket cutter designed to trim hedges, and he knew what a carotid artery was. He cut. There was a flower of Caesarathi blood. The boy fell sideways, rolling, air ripping out of his lungs, eyes the size of moons. The caretaker didn't get a second strike. He went down under the crushing weight of an armored foot. But in the 3 seconds he bought, something happened that would be replayed across the galaxy for a century. The smallest ones did not scatter. They crawled and curled themselves over the fallen caretaker's head, tiny bodies making a clumsy shield, the way penguins will cluster on the ice. There was a murmur as if 1,000 mothers had exhaled the same breath. The Caesarathi paused, momentarily undone by a courage that looked like stubbornity. Roa stared at the boot on the man's chest. She bared her little teeth, not in hate but in something more ancient. In those 3 seconds, Kite of Theseus fell across the face of Solace like a new star. Mara had not waited for the timer. She had judged the space between hungriness and horror and found the only course. Her jump drove through the gravity well, shattering the shields of normal caution. She came out of nothingness 30,000 kilometers lower than was healthy, hull singing, gravity coils howling, crew harnesses biting. She rode the groan of physics and breathed. "Fire," she said, not loud, very clear. Lances of inert mass left the deck guns at near-relativistic speeds. They were simple. They had been forging such rods since before the first human walked on Mars. They were thick enough to break a cruiser's back. 3 Caesarathi ships died before the rest understood. The others angled. Their commander had learned to respect human artillery during border incidents near the drifting maw. He screamed orders. He formed his fleet into a spear as if he might push through and out, leaving the rubble of a lesson behind. Mara denied him the dignity of a clean retreat. "Cut them," she told her gunnery crews. "Bleed their engines. Leave their hulls intact so they have to watch the sky." Kite's flanking escorts arrived like wolves late to the hunt. Canticle, Pell, Yoke. Their communications were spare. The gunners did not curse. They whispered the names of the fallen guardians into their own ears, not transmitting, as if words could steady aim. They fired until the air around the Caesarathi spear was snowing with glittering condensation from vaporized armor. On the surface, the Caesarathi leader made a choice informed by the slow panic crawling up his spine. If he could not carry the children away, he would make sure the humans learned the cost of defiance. He lifted his wrist. He triggered collars that his troops had clamped to 10 small throats minutes earlier. The collars didn't detonate. They simply tightened. Across the human network, a chain of code woke up with the fury of a tribesman who finds his child stolen. 100 years ago, after a different abduction on a different world, humanity had buried an ugly promise in its systems. If you tie a device to the throat of a child, everything on our side that can see you becomes a knife. Emergency microsats winked awake from disguised housings and began to jam. Local fabricators hacked themselves into fabricating nothing but precise keys. The school's own maintenance bots scuttled through ducts with patient machine courage, dragging fibers and fusing circuits. Teachers bled quietly and kept working their consoles with shaking fingers because children were watching them and would remember how adults behave. Mara breathed out. Special tasking to the gardener teams. The gardener teams were not botanists. They had grown out of the way humans think about cities. You don't just build skyscrapers and leave the soil starving. You plant, you prune, you tend. In war, the gardeners were the ones who moved through broken places, cutting away traps, clearing mines, coaxing life to keep breathing. Gardener grid ready came the answer. A dozen small craft clamped to the underside of Kite, loaded with glittering webs and the little miracles defectors dream up in lonely rooms. We have the signal architecture for the collars. Probability they were bought cheap and modded. We can spoof, or we can force contest. Children's necks are not for contests, Mara said. Spoof. They went down through the atmosphere like seeds on the wind, but with precision a dandelion can only dream. They landed on a circle around the central green. Their pilots stepped out with spider-like constructs clinging to their shoulders. Those spiders made a mesh in the air like frost forming quickly on glass. They made a place where the collars thought they were alone in the universe. The collars sighed. They released. One of the gardeners wept quietly where only his companion could hear. He had lost a child once to fever. He had learned to keep his hands steady. He did what his hands knew how to do. The Kite leader looked at his wrist as if betrayal were a thing that could sprout there. He struck a child across the face, a motion old as contempt. She didn't cry. He snarled. He lifted his weapon. He looked up. The gray, clean underbelly of Kite of Theseus had come down to kiss the sky. Its landing tines remained retracted, hovering on a halo of magnetic force. Its guns had not lowered. It did not need to. The ship's presence was a pressure in the lungs. Even the children who did not know ship design felt it, something patient and massive and furious, like an old mountain that had decided to move for them. A walkway telescoped from Kite to the green. No battle hymn played, no banners unfurled. 3 people walked out: Admiral Mara Iseul, a gardener captain named Cyan, a medic, Jorai, who carried a bag not large enough for what she wanted and precisely packed for what she could do. Mara carried no sidearm. She had a simple ceramic baton and the knowledge that there were 100 guns above her ready to answer her breath's change. She stepped down onto the grass with the care of someone entering a sacred place. She did not run. Running would have disordered everything. She looked at the children first. She inclined her head the way you do when you are a guest in a home and the hosts have suffered. Then she looked at the Kite. The leader opened his mouth to speak a word that might have been dominance if it had arrived a minute earlier. Now it only sounded like a crack. "These are ours," he tried. "They are collateral until your—" Mara's baton touched the edge of his blade with a sound like a drop of water falling into a deep well. "You hurt human children," she said. The words were quiet. Her ship was vast and she was small, and she sounded like a teacher asking a classroom to calm. "Do you realize what comes next?" He smiled with a mouth taught in cruelty. "Extinction," he hissed. "Not yours," Mara said. "Your extinction would tempt us to forget. We can't afford that." Her eyes were gray, cold as a hailstorm. "What comes next is an education." Her baton moved. It wasn't a blow meant to kill. It was a choreographed permission to her ship. Kite's floodlights blew the day open. Drones swept down, moving like schools of fish, scooping children into warm compartments soft with microfoam. Gardeners knelt, slipping shield blankets over small shoulders. Medics moved like prayers fulfilled. The Kite raised weapons and found them heavy as guilt. Gravity had shifted on the green, brief and precise, their joints blooming with ache. Kite hummed. The Kite leader tried to swing. His blade caught weight it hadn't carried a breath earlier. He staggered. Mara touched his wrist with her baton and the muscles of his forearm juddered into sleep. "I do not need to kill you," she said. "I need you to witness." He laughed, gasping. "We will return. We will break all your schools. We will grind you." "Possibly," Mara said. "You've made that harder with today's choices." She tapped her baton to the air beside his neck. "For 1,000 years," she said softly, not to him but to the sky, "we have tried to teach the galaxy that our children are not pawns. Somehow the lesson never sticks." She looked back at him. "We will teach it again." Above them, the remaining Kite ships tried to surge toward orbit. The escort stretched a net of ion trails. The human ships didn't slaughter the Kite. They slowed them, peeled their engines, broke their confidence, left them breathing. On a dozen worlds, human voices spoke to cameras. They did not shout. They did not foam. They said one after another, "We will not let you teach our children that they are prey. We will show them what we do when someone tries." A week later, a fleet the size of a storm formed over the quiet dockyards at Thunder's cold steppe. They were not the capital ships that nations parade when they are feeling fragile. They were haulers, lifters, repair frames, medships, schoolships, couriers. Human states argued, human captains fueled anyway. Old miners smoothed their voices over intercoms and said they had a little spare propellant. Farmers on the water world of Tsara stuffed their hold space with grain. Mara did not call this a counterstrike. She called it a procession. The procession did not go to the capital Kaisarathi world. It went to every Kaisarathi outpost that had a school. At each one it landed. It set up kitchens. It built clinics. It worked. It offered water, vaccines, universal mathematics kits, fiber spools. It taught. The human word for what it did was unfairly gentle, invest, but nothing about the way the gardeners moved into hard neighborhoods was gentle at all. They cleaned. They listened. They learned the names of Kaisarathi children and pronounced them properly. At some outposts, Kaisarathi warbands came scuttling down, spines raised. The procession ignored the weapons as long as it could. When it couldn't, it broke them. Not with dramatic beams, but with the slow, humiliating reality of civilian mass. 100 haulers encircled a warband and waited. When the warband fired, 1,000 soft drones folded over their muzzles like patient hands. The Kaisarathi learned to leave the procession alone because the procession made their people healthier, and their people began to ask displeasing questions. Why do we spend on weapons when our children are hungry? Why do we tell ourselves that fear is the only language anyone understands? The Kaisarathi leadership panicked in a way tyrants always do when the tools of soft power arrive with harder patience than any gun. They called the procession illegal. They shrieked edicts. They cut power to outposts as if darkness would make humans leave. Humans brought their own lights. Mara did not smile often. The procession did not feel like victory. It felt like grief set to work. At night aboard Kite, she walked the garden corridor where spinach grew and dill scented the air. She read the list of names that had come in from Meadow's Reach. Most of the children were alive. Some were not. She carried the dead in her voice when she sent orders in the morning. People heard something in that tone and responded with their very best. On one world, a Kaisarathi mother approached a kitchen where a human boy was kneading dough for bread. She stared at his hands. She said nothing because her jaw was rigid with the memory of propaganda. Humans are cruel. Humans are snakes. Humans will kill your children and laugh. The boy looked up. He offered her a round of dough without words. She found her mouth softening against her will. That was the day she began to doubt. Kaisarathi intelligence tried a different tactic. They abducted a human convoy near the Blue Knife Nebula, a convoy of school ships, thinking that if this was the human sacred, then pressure there would force retreat. They chose poorly. The school ships were not non-combatants in the way the Kaisarathi understood. They had old hulls, but they had teachers aboard, and teachers know how to hold lines better than soldiers sometimes, because classrooms are small universes of small people. The convoy bristled with defensive drones that had started life as science projects. When the Kaisarathi boarded, they found themselves tangled in nets woven by bored children who had learned knotwork for fun and discovered it had other uses. A teacher named Hfy held a door with his shoulder, sang off-key to keep his class from crying, and when a Kaisarathi soldier slammed him down, the smallest child in the room came and lay across his back, so the next blow would hit 2 bodies instead of 1. On some deep level that never surfaces in palace speeches, the Kaisarathi had believed humans were sophisticated cowards. The images from the convoy corrected that error in a way no diplomatic memo ever could. The procession reached the stone world of Narex, a Sci-Fi cluster where young were trained early in the arts of fear. The locals watched with tight mouths as gardeners planted grass in dirt nobody had bothered to love. The Sci-Fi children were thin. Their games were violent and uncreative. The human lunch line made no commentary when those thin bodies pushed to the front. They ate. They stared at the gardener's soft armor with its scuffed knees. There were no loud speeches. There were bandages. On the third day, a Sci-Fi child followed a human medic and tugged her sleeve. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing not at a tool but at the medic's face. Confusion molded his mouth. "You are supposed to hate us." The medic tucked a loose coil of hair behind one ear. She was tired and she smelled like soap. "I am not built for hate," she said. "I have work to do." The Sci-Fi child considered that like it was a weapon he might learn to wield. He blinked his play ties slowly. "What happens if we hurt your children again?" The medic did not look at him like he was a monster. She looked at him like he was 9. "Then we come back," she said, "with more blankets, more food, more ships, more patience than anyone believes is possible. We will fight when we must, but after that, we will build until your leaders have nothing left to threaten. We will keep coming until even your stories give up on fear." The child's spine plates eased. He nodded like a student writing something down inside, an assignment due much later. The Sci-Fi leadership grew desperate. They sent assassins for Mara Iseul. One of them came across the hull of Kite at night, clinging in a suit with skin of the purest black, a blade that could cut a molecule's pride. He made it to the garden corridor. He watched her in the dill-scented air. He raised his hand. Mara did not carry a weapon in the gardens. She had a watering can. She put it down. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who had chosen her trial in advance. He saw something then that he had not trained to see. It slowed his hand enough for a safety drone to whisper a net over his wrist. He struggled. She didn't step back. "Do you want me to beg?" she asked quietly. He didn't know the word for what he felt. He had seen beggars. This was not that. It was a woman with a back straight enough to carry a species on it. His blade kissed air and was gone, swallowed by the quiet hum of the net. He hissed. "Sit," she said, because he was someone's child too. "I can make you tea, but it will taste like dill. It's all I have here." "You will kill us all," he spat, but his voice had less practice than his hands. "No," she said, "we won't. We will make your children stubborn, then you will have to learn a new language." They did not speak for a while. The assassin looked at the watering can. He did not understand how a weapon like that could have conquered anything. Human diplomats begged Mara to scale it down. "We are stretching logistics to snapping," one said. "There will be a bill for this." "There is always a bill," Mara replied. "I'm paying this one with my name." She sent letters to her old commanders, to the aunt who had once taught her how to sand a wooden chair until your palms loved it, to the engineers who had built Kite. She told them she was ready for trial when the procession had finished. She told them she would accept sentence. They told her to shut up and keep going. News drifted through the cosmic commons the way weather crosses plains. On planets that had never heard of Meadow's reach, children learned the name because their parents whispered it as a blessing when bandits came. The procession left as quietly as it arrived and returned twice, then 4 times, then not at all because the clinics were there to stay. People named their goats Kite. They named their sons Mara, which embarrassed the Admiral when she found out, but she said nothing because if a people chooses a name to hold courage, who are you to correct them? Not every story ended with a kitchen and a clinic. Some ended with necessary violence. In a glass arena off the Sci-Fi world belt, one of the warband leaders announced a demonstration. He would execute 5 human volunteers and broadcast it. 5 humans stood in a line. They were not soldiers. They were teachers, gardeners, a cook. They didn't weep. They looked straight ahead. Before the first blow fell, the arena's floor erupted with soft drones the size of birds. Children's science projects again. distributed intelligence that had learned to braid itself into a cloud. The drones tangled the warband's blades. They carried the human volunteers out like an embarrassing rescue scene from a children's show, except the crowd cried. The Caesarathi leadership tried to cut the transmission. The drone cloud cut their cut. A week later, that warband leader was removed, not by a human bullet, by his own. In the years that followed, Caesarathi authorities put up new laws because they could not admit the old had failed. They called them cautiously the Sanctuary Acts. They forbade military action within 1,000 strides of any registered school. They listed complex definitions of school, worried that humans would cheat. Humans didn't cheat. They recognized the intent. They registered schools human and Caesarathi and Valon and all the rest. They stationed a gardener's ship in orbit above each new school like a slow, watchful planet. And still there were moments when the old reflex, the lunge toward fear, rose up like a snake striking. That was all right. Humans had patience long as arthritis and steady as old timber. Admiral Mara Iseul kept moving. She wore that basalt ring until it cracked with age. When people asked her what victory felt like, she said she couldn't tell. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for clean water and quiet classrooms. At the trial, because there had to be a trial, traditions matter, she stood straight. The tribunal asked her if she had suspended due process. She said yes. They asked her if she would do it again. She said yes, but slower, but softer, but yes. They reprimanded her with words that were warm with gratitude below the formal arch. Then they asked her to keep doing her job. She walked back to Kite in a hail of little paper stars thrown by children who had snuck out of their classes to watch. Someone shouted Admiral Bread. Because of the kitchens. She blushed, then bowed, because you bow to your critics and your fans and your future. Years later, when the Caesarathi people looked back, they discovered that the moment that had scared them into endless aggression, the human arrival with guns blazing, was not the moment that changed them. It was the day human gardeners had planted grass in dead soil and told their children to play on it. It was the day a human medic had still hands while a collar sighed open and fell from a small throat. It was the day the assassin didn't kill because the woman with the watering can had offered him tea. Roa grew tall and impatient with injustice. She returned to Narix with a bag of chalk and taught math on a stoop until someone gave her a classroom. Lynn invented a cheap valve for low-pressure irrigation. The caretaker's name was carved into a small stone under an ironwood tree on Meadows Reach, and there was a bench beside it with a view of the lake, and people who sat there found themselves a little braver than before. Mara grew older. Her crew stayed because ships remember the hands that bring them safely home. She went gray all the way and cut her hair shorter and started drinking decaf because her heart had opinions. When she died, it was on a balcony above a garden corridor where dill still scented the air. She had a list of names in her pocket and a sentence on her lips. Even the Caesarathi sent a wreath. The card said nothing. It did not need to. What stayed longer than wreaths was a habit that spread like water. On worlds where children woke to storms and old fear, ships sometimes came down gentle and people built kitchens in the rain. They did not always fly human flags. That was all right. Ideas don't belong to anyone once they are in the dirt. There would be other crises, other small wars in the long reach of time. There would be politicians hungry for the hard theater of victory. There would be critics who called the procession a waste, who demanded a clean ending with an enemy broken forever. There were even people who accused humanity of conquest by kindness. Memos were written, speeches delivered, but on significant days, down corridors that smelled of dill and oil and clean water, decisions were made by people who remembered a quiet voice on a green field asking a cruel man if he understood what came next. Sometimes they replayed the old footage. It was cleaned and remastered so the pixel blur of the past didn't obscure the tiny shoulder of a child pulling tight against another child's body. Editors added captions in 12 languages. In 100 world schools, 1,000 teachers stopped the feed at the moment where the collars sighed open and said, "Look carefully, see this. In this frame is the future." They did not always mean the technology. In a bar on the edge of the Persian Drift, a miner with a nose forever crooked from the fight on Meadows Reach bought a drink for a Kaserathi trader with repaired spine plates. They watched a ship drift by, one of the school shuttles that ran students between places where laughter linked the species together like beads on a string. The miner lifted his glass. "To the kids," he said. The Kaserathi touched his glass because some rituals cross species without asking permission. "To the ones who taught us," he said. The ship's engines purred a lullaby in steel. Somewhere on board, a child argued confidently with another child about the behavior of comets. Somewhere else, a child pressed her face to the window and decided that when she grew up she would plant trees on rocks and call it gardening. There was a dragon-painted backpack on the floor and a half-finished drawing of a blue-green moon under a stubborn sun. The pilot checked the route and whistled under his breath. The same tune his grandmother had used to water basil in a window box on an old station above Earth. A tune that meant life keeps learning. There will be new tyrants. There will be old aches. There will be days when the galaxy forgets again, because forgetting is simple and remembering requires work. But there will also be kitchens and clinics and soft drones that fold over the cruel like patient hands. There will be gardeners so tired they can't stand straight, but they keep planting anyway. There will be human ships that hum like home, and there will be other people's ships humming alongside them. And there will be ironwood trees beside a lake on Meadows Reach, leaves speaking in the rain. The stone there will gather moss because children's fingers leave warm prints. People will sit on the bench and read the name of a man who used a hedge cutter like a sword, because his job that morning had been to keep the grounds neat, and his job that afternoon had been to make sure a boy could fall sideways and live. They will cry, maybe, or they will smile, both good. They will get up and go back to their work. In the end, the lesson remained steady as gravity. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.